And then I would ask everybody to please go ahead and put your name and your organization in the chat. Introduce yourselves. If you have any introductory questions that you have for Alan, you can put those in there as well. I want to turn it over to first Joan Dreesen from the Association of Community Services to see if she would like to give any welcoming words. Go ahead, Joan.
Absolutely. Thank you, Glenn. And I would just like to thank the Horizon Foundation for sponsoring this event and inviting our members, and I see a number of them here, to be part of it. Advocacy is something that we are all passionate about, but it's really difficult for some of us to know what those guardrails are. How do we keep our 501c3 status safe during an election period? So this is incredibly relevant to all of us now. So thank you, Horizon, and thank you, Alan. And I will turn it back to you, Glenn.
Great, thanks, Joan. I want to turn it over to Rena Rambarat, and Rena from the Local Health Improvement Coalition. Turn it over to you.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome. Thank you, Glenn, and thanks everyone for having us. Our coalition is Howard County Local Health Improvement Coalition, which is actually part of the Howard County Health Department, and we are a huge organization with over 500 members and about roughly 200 partner organizations. Many of these organizations are nonprofits. So what we try to do is we work collaboratively with our partners for our shared goals and objectives through various priorities that we work towards. So this is a great opportunity. We always love to support our organizations and our partners. And likewise, we look forward to continuing to work with many of you in our priorities. So if you're not familiar with the coalition, please feel free to visit our website at hclhig.org to learn how you can be involved in our efforts. Thank you.
Fabulous. Thanks, Rena. And to both Rena and Joan, could you please put your contact info and your websites in the chat? That would be very helpful. And before I move forward, so I'm Glenn Schneider. I'm with the Horizon Foundation, and we are excited to see many of our grantees and our community partners here with us today. And I would say more so than anything else, as you all know, we like to partner and work on policy and systems changes. Particularly that seems scarier during election season. So we like to do this during election seasons to be able to remind everybody what is required, to be able to know the rules of the game. Because when you know the rules, you don't have to be scared. You can actually function within there and advocate for the things that you feel are important and know that you are safely doing so. And that's why we are pleased to have Alan Madison here with us today. Alan Madison, I will just start and say that he is the foundation's lawyer. So let me go ahead and put that out there. But why is he the foundation's lawyer? Alan is from Trister Ross Shadler and Gold law firm, and he is a longtime nonprofit expert when it comes to legal stuff related to nonprofits and how to make sure that you are following all the tenets of the law to do what you should be doing to advocate properly. Alan has worked in a variety of different positions. He's worked in the U.S. Senate for a senator. He's worked for a national advocacy organization like the Sierra Club. And for sure, he has even written books related to what nonprofits are allowed to do and not. I've come in contact with Alan over the course of my career, working for the American Heart Association or Voices for Healthy Kids and a number of other different large organizations who all have the same concerns that we have today that brought us here today. So I'm excited that Alan has agreed to be a part of our session today and to lead us through a couple of logistical things. If you have questions throughout, put them in the chat or raise your hand on your handy dandy reaction panel down here at the bottom. And Alan has said that he will stop to make sure that all of our questions are answered, that we get all the information that we need to move forward and do it well during this both primary and general election season. Sound good? We all good to start? All right, I'm going to turn it over to Alan. Alan, welcome. And by all means, let me know if you have any issues throughout sharing screens or whatever, and we'll go from there.
All right, thanks so much, Glenn. I appreciate it. And thank you all for joining on the call. As Glenn mentioned, my background is working with nonprofits. I do a lot of work with a variety of environmental groups and public health groups and voting rights groups and all sorts of other nonprofits in the advocacy space. And along the lines of what Joan was saying, the goal is one problem is that if people don't know where the lines are, they get really hesitant, right? People don't know what they can do, but they know they're not supposed to get involved with elections. And what people tend to do is just hang back. And so the goal that we've had today between what we were discussing with Glenn earlier is let's figure out how to help people understand where the line is so that you guys can get your toes right up to the line. That the IRS sets out rules for C3s, and that's what we're going to talk about today, is how 501c3 organizations can get involved during an election season without being overly cautious. We need to know where the line is, but the goal isn't to stay way back from the line. The goal is understand what the line is and then get your toes up to the line so that you can understand within your organization's own risk tolerance what you can and can't do. Now, some organizations are going to have more of an aversion to risk than others, and so you need to know, what's comfortable for your organization. But the first step to doing all of that is learning where that line is. And so that's what we're going to talk about today, or what are the rules? How do we advance our policy goals in an election season? Just because there's an election coming up in November or in 29 days, as Glenn reminds me of for the primary, just because there's an election coming up doesn't mean that we have to shut down. It doesn't mean that we have to stop working on our issues, but we do have to think about things in a new dimension. And so we'll talk about those dimensions, and we will apply those theories to real world examples. All right, as Glenn mentions, 49 days. I live over in Montgomery County, and I'm sure you guys also, I'm just getting hit with so much mail, it feels like 29 days, but okay, so we've got a little bit, month and a half after the primary got moved. And as Glenn mentioned, I want this to be a discussion. So ask questions, come off of mute. I'm going to ask you all questions. The more that we can get participation going, the better for all of us. I don't want to hear myself drone in a monologue any more than any of you guys want that. So the main thing to think about and understand is that we've got a balancing act here as 501c3 organizations. You've got the right under the First Amendment to keep talking about our issues. Just because there's an election going on doesn't mean we lose our First Amendment right to educate the public, to talk about our issues. At the same time, as a C3, we're not allowed to intervene in an election. That's the language from section 501c3 is we can't intervene. And what that means is we can't show any bias or preference for or against any candidate. So that's more than simply saying vote for or vote against a particular candidate. It's a quite a broad stretch of activities where we can't help in a candidate in any way. We can't be giving candidates a platform to speak that would be promoting their campaign. We can't be using our organizational resources to promote them as a candidate. At the same time, many of those candidates are elected officials. We have to work with elected officials. The policy change process keeps chugging along. So we've got an opportunity to change policy, to improve the systems and the environment that we live in. And in the Horizons case, for example, we've got opportunities to make people in Howard County healthier. We need to take those opportunities, and we can't let them pass us by just because there's an election going on. So that's what we'll talk about, is how do we keep pressing those policy goals without indicating opposition or support of particular candidates. And also, as C3 organizations, we're allowed to engage in civic activities that strengthen our democracy. And there's never been a time that that's more important than right now. So there's a whole panoply of civic engagement activities that we're allowed to get involved with in a C3 space. You just need to know how to do it safely. So what we'll talk about today, we're going to talk first about some of that civic engagement work, and then we'll talk about public education activities that C3s can engage in, whether they be policy advocacy or educating the public about candidates themselves, or getting candidates to understand our issues. That's a really important C3 activity that we can be doing. And the other thing is, what about us as individuals? What can we do personally outside of work? Because that always winds up being a bugaboo for some folks is, my day doesn't end at 6 o'clock, but at the same time, I want to be involved and getting involved in my community and helping particular candidates because I care about issues generally. And how do we do that without getting our organizations wrapped up or getting the organizations in trouble? So we'll talk about all those things. So in the civic engagement bucket, there's both voter registration activities we can do and get out the vote activities. And I'm not going to talk about voter reg at all today. And the reason it's possible to do C3 voter registration activities, it is legally fraught and it's really hard work for a C3 to do. So it's not the sort of thing to dive into as a C3 until you're sort of an expert at these other things. And arguably, and we're not going to get into an argument over it right here, but arguably the get out the vote work is more important than this voter reg work. Voter registration is sexy. Funders love to fund it because it's measurable. You can say, hey, we registered 1,236 people through the work that you did. Getting people registered takes a lot of money per registration, a lot of time. You've got a high legal risk as an organization if you mess up at all. And it doesn't guarantee that people vote. Those people who register may or may not actually cast a ballot. The more important thing for democracy, in my view, is getting people who are registered, whether they're new registrants or whether they've been registered 1 or 2 election cycles, or whether they are a lifelong registrant. Getting people to actually cast the ballots is critically important. And that's a perfectly fine activity for C3s to engage in, as long as you do it in a nonpartisan way. You can't obviously be telling people, hey, get out and vote November 8th because we got to elect Democrats or we got to re-elect Hogan, whatever it may be. That's obviously off the table, but encouraging people to vote, helping them understand about voting deadlines, helping them understand, hey, early voting is going to be more convenient, or if you're stuck at home, here's an easy way to vote by mail. All of those things are perfectly fine for a C3 to get involved with, of educating voters to get involved in the civic process, as long as we're not showing a bias or preference for particular candidates. We can use foundation grants for it, which is really important. A lot of times, the money that you're getting from private foundations will say you can't use the money for lobbying. Obviously, you can't use it for supporting or opposing candidates. But most foundation grants also say in there that you can't use it for a voter registration drive because of an arcane part of the IRS tax code that we're not going to get into. But it means that if your foundation grant says you can't use it for voter registration drives, that doesn't cover get out the vote. So even though that foundation grant may be restricted, you can use those foundation grants for doing nonpartisan get out the vote drives, where you're encouraging people to cast a ballot. You're reminding them when election day is. You're explaining their options for how to get there and how to cast that ballot. So those are all options for you. Laura, I'm glad you saw the shout out there to Maryland LCV-EF. So what are the boundaries of what we're doing with our nonpartisan voter reg, with our nonpartisan GeoTV rather? Obviously it's nonpartisan. The messaging here is that it can't simply be vote November 8th because climate change depends on it, for example. It can't be a very narrow message that would be aligned with one particular candidate. It can't be based, for example, can't be vote pro-choice or anything like that, because that's more likely to align with one particular candidate or candidates with a particular party. And the IRS would say that that is a bias or preference toward a candidate. It's safer to mention a whole bunch of issues so that you can show that your program isn't aligned with any particular candidate. You can say, vote November 8th because it's important for education, for a clean environment, for good jobs, and for promoting healthcare. That doesn't align with any particular candidate, you can emphasize that all of those issues are on the ballot November 8th. But because we're talking about a broad panoply of issues, it's not as likely to align with a particular candidate as if an example of saying, as I mentioned, vote pro-choice or vote for climate change, vote for solutions to climate change, because that's going to be more aligned with a particular party or candidate. The other issue with nonpartisan GeoTV is targeting, because targeting can, in and of itself, show a bias or preference. So one option for targeting is just target everyone in the public. Set up a table outside of a grocery store, and encourage everybody who walks in and out of the grocery store to vote November 8th. Give them voting information. Set it up in outside of church services or any other gathering, at PTA events, back to school events. Just target everybody. That's totally fine. The other thing the IRS allows is the IRS allows C3s to target historically underrepresented communities. And these are communities that are, we'll get into more detail in just a little bit, but basically communities that have voted at rates lower than the overall voting percentages for the population, either because of historical discrimination, systemic racism, sexism, whatever it may be that is suppressing those voting rates. The IRS allows you to overcome that with your nonpartisan GeoTV. So a question here. So here's an example. Not one of my clients.
Alec, do you
So
want to go outside or
I'm
stand?
sorry, what was that? So one of the issues here is this is a nonpartisan GeoTV mailer that an organization did. What do people think about this? Is this allowable for a C3, or would this be not allowable for a C3? Does anyone want to just, and what's your reasoning? So why don't you write in the chat box whether folks think this is allowable or not allowable for a C3? What aspects of that can you get into? So we've got Christine saying it's allowable because we don't mention a particular candidate. A couple of people saying it's narrow because it's narrow, only one issue. Targets water contamination, Bertina says. Jim thinks it's fact-based. We've got Nancy, you said it's not allowable because it might align with a particular candidate. What do you mean by that? Do you want to come off of mute and sort of explain that a little more?
I was just thinking that there might be, that might be the focus of a particular candidate. And so that would mean that you could easily see who that message is really in favor of.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That, in my view, this is really questionable. It's not clearly over the line. And in fact, everyone is essentially right. You guys are all, it's ambiguous. And I think that what you said, Nancy, is exactly right. It depends on the context here. That if you're doing this in a race where there is distinguished, where the candidates are distinguished on the issue of drinking water, then it would certainly be over the line. We need to know whether this aligns with a particular candidate. Do all of the candidates have essentially the same set of positions? I think it's a very aggressive piece, but not clearly over the line. But it really is something where, as Nancy says, it would depend on the context of this, of whether it would be allowable or not. Here's another example, and this one in particular, actually is a client of mine, so I'll own this one, and maybe that gives away the answer. I shouldn't have said that. So here we've got a door hanger that the new North Carolina League of Conservation Voters Foundation distributed. And it talks about, it says, we're struggling to make ends meet in North Carolina. Economic opportunity through good jobs is on the ballot, clean air for healthy communities, affordable access to clean energy. What do you guys think about this one? Guys, put it up in the chat box also. I'll show you the front again. It says register, vote, we will be heard. Our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter. Quoting Dr. Martin Luther King. A couple of people thinking it's allowable because it's a broader range of issues. Yeah, I kind of gave it away, I guess, when I said it was my client. So almost by definition, I'm not going to share something from one of my clients that I told them they couldn't do. So I think I gave that away. Yeah, this is a broader range of issues, but it's not as broad as it could be. There's some risk. You're still talking about sort of environmental issues with clean air and clean energy. So it's not as broad as it could be, but it struck the balance of what they, within their risk tolerance, felt was appropriate. And Christine, you were asking a question about messaging here. That's where it's, depending on the context of a lot of people being out of work, where it says, let me just pull this, just bounced out of here. Christine, do you want to come off of mute and explain a little bit more about the context of the question you were asking about targeting here relating to workforce education, where you say if you care about education and workforce development, vote?
Yeah, so I think I work for JobSource NYC, and we're an intermediary, so this is particularly important to us. We certainly try to go to council meetings to advocate for young adults. And I know, the first example you gave about the contaminants, if you are not directly endorsing a particular candidate or I guess maybe a council member, would that be walking the line, as you were saying? And the same thing, we advocate for young people. So if we say go out and vote, is there an issue? What would really be the issue with saying go out and vote?
That's a great question. So the issue here would be, so the example would be, if you care about education and workforce development, if you want to make sure that young people have good job opportunities, go ahead and vote. Make sure you vote on election day. And that's something like that is probably relatively broad. As Nancy said, it would depend on whether in that particular jurisdiction, whether there are candidates who are trying to distinguish themselves on jobs for young people. So if there's a candidate who's been making it a clear part of their platform to say, hey, we need to make sure we have a strong education system and more workforce development, more vocational training or what have you, then that would align with a particular candidate in that race. If it's more broadly applicable, where all of the candidates have various plans for education and workforce development, then something like that wouldn't necessarily distinguish between the candidates. And so that's the key is, for example, if you just went out and said, vote for kids, all the candidates are pro-kid, right? That's not gonna be viewed as distinguishing between candidates, as saying, vote for candidates who'll support kids. But the more you narrow it down to talk about things like workforce development or find candidates who have strong vocational training programs in their platform and vote for them, then you're really directing it more specifically. And so that's why this broad panoply of issues is really helpful. I'm glad you asked that question. Thank you. The other part, so that's sort of the messaging of it, is having a broad message that's not going to distinguish between candidates. The other thing that the IRS allows is people to target based on overcoming systemic racism or historic discrimination to strengthen our democracy. So, For example, women, Latinos, Black voters, all of those groups are historically have voted at rates under the overall population for various reasons. And so it's perfectly fine to target your get out the vote materials at those particular groups, as long as it's based on that demographic targeting of historically underrepresented communities. So for example, targeting young Black women is okay because all of those are groups that are historically underrepresented in population. Targeting young Black women environmentalists, though, adds that issue overlay, which means you're targeting people who are not based on historically underrepresented community characteristics. And so that's more likely to be aligned with particular candidates. And so that would cross the line for what the IRS allows. But one of the issues, for example, Jim Sanders in the questions noted, seniors typically vote at very high rates, but with COVID, there are new barriers to seniors voting. They don't want to be crowded together in a polling place. They don't want to be standing in line with other people in a gymnasium hallway for 6 hours, for example, because it's dangerous for them. So what we can do is we can target our GeoTV messaging, not necessarily at seniors in general, but we can target overall the overall population to make sure that people understand that there are options to voting, because these impediments they're higher risk for seniors, but they're also higher risk for people with immune compromised individuals and all sorts of other people who have obstacles to voting or have risks of COVID. COVID, as we know, targets Black and brown communities, or Black and brown communities suffer from COVID rates that are extremely high for a whole variety of reasons. And so getting the information about COVID safe voting out broadly to the public is perfectly fine as part of Nonpartisan GeoTV. You might be fine arguing with the IRS to say, hey, these seniors are particularly vulnerable to COVID, so we needed to get this COVID voting information out to seniors. And that doesn't have any partisan impact, but certainly doing it in a broader manner to target all voters with that information about voting options in COVID would certainly be a safer option there. I'm glad you asked that question there, Jim. So any questions there about the Nonpartisan GeoTV, about encouraging people to vote and get involved, before we move on to some of the candidate education work? As questions arise, certainly keep them in mind. Feel free to add those to the chat box, and we'll address those as we go along. So the next category of work is moving from focusing on nonpartisan voting information to talking about and to candidates in particular. And the first one I wanted to mention is candidate briefings, which are a really impactful tool, really powerful tool, especially if we're doing it at the local level. Because what it means is, as you all know, local candidates are still developing their ideas about issues. They don't know about a plethora of issues, and they realize, hey, I'm leaping into this campaign because I care about these particular issues over here, but I don't know about this other stuff. And so the degree to which we can educate candidates about our issues early, we'll really have an important impact in terms of setting their priorities, setting their understanding of our issues, setting how they're going to wind up voting if they get elected on those issues, how they'll talk about those issues on the stump when they're a candidate. And the more we can do early in their career to get them aligned with our policy issues and understanding why our policy issues matter, the more impact we're going to have over the course of their career. So I really encourage you to do candidate education, to brief candidates on the issues. So the trick here is you got to make the information available to all of the candidates for a given office. It needs to be equally available. What you can do is, but that doesn't mean that if only some candidates are interested, that you can only talk to them if all candidates are interested. What it means is send out information, put together a briefing packet on your issues with some op-eds, some talking points, fact sheets about your issues. Send it to all of the candidates for a given office. And then offer them an in-person briefing. Say, here's information about our issue. We'd love to come in and talk to you about it so that we can answer any questions you might have, dispel any misnomers that you might have heard over the years, and answer, just let us know how we can be helpful to you. If only one or two of those candidates wants to have a briefing with you, that's fine. You don't have to barge your way into everybody's office, right? There's some candidates who aren't interested in hearing from you. Some candidates who are already set in their ways. Some candidates feel like they don't need information from you, and others will be open, receptive. So you can go ahead and talk just to those folks who are open and receptive to you. The issue is, though, ironically, you kind of have to stop when you have success. And what I mean by that is that if a candidate gets really jazzed about your issue from your meeting, they might say, hey, I'm really into this. I'd love to give a speech about that issue. Can you write a speech for me? Can you write me an op-ed that I could place in the Baltimore Sun about this issue so that I can raise attention on the issue? And that's unfortunately where you need to say no. Because at that point, you'd be serving essentially as that candidate's campaign consultant. You'd be part of their campaign, helping them. And that would show a bias or preference when you're writing op-eds or writing a speech for a particular candidate. So the thing I recommend there is your briefing packet should have all of the information available, all of the materials available for them to write that speech on their own, for them to be able to write that op-ed, and give them the talking points on the front end in your briefing packet, so that if you do have success and you are able to turn them into a champion on your issue, they're ready to go from day one as soon as you walk out of that briefing, and they can be talking about it on the stump without having to ask you to write new materials for them. Any questions about those candidate briefings or that kind of event or that sort of outreach to candidates? I really do encourage folks to do it either as an individual organization or as a coalition of groups, because it has such an impact, and it's the sort of thing that candidates really appreciate. And they'll remember it. They'll remember it when they are elected, that they'll keep relying on you as an important source of credible information. So let's shift from talking to candidates to educating the public now. Oh, one thing I do want to mention about these candidate briefings is you can't talk to reporters or to the public about which candidates accepted your meeting, which candidates seemed interested and engaged when you had that meeting with them. So for example, on this picture, which is a group from the Audubon Society took Senator McCain out bird watching in Arizona as part of their candidate education. They couldn't invite the media to accompany them on that bird watching candidate education trip, because then that would show the public, oh, Senator McCain accepted the Audubon Society's invitation to learn about wildlife. He must be someone that they then support, right? So the candidate briefing has to be private, and you can't talk to the press or the public or publish a scorecard, for example, of which candidates accepted your invitation or which ones asked the best questions in the meeting. So the next category here that I'm going to lump together a little bit are forums, debates, and candidate questionnaires. And just to define my terms, a candidate forum is an event where all of the candidates are invited and asked to speak, as opposed to a debate where you're inviting candidates, perhaps have a threshold for viability, where you're only inviting the top candidates who've met some sort of a neutral viability standard that you've set, and where they're rather than just being asked to address topics to the general public, they're actually addressing one another in their debate questions. And then candidate questionnaires, which a lot of 501c3 organizations like to do, which is a questionnaire is you ask all of the candidates to answer the same set of questions in writing. You provide them all a word limit so that you don't have to do any editing. You want to avoid on a candidate questionnaire any sort of a situation where you're editing their responses. You just say, hey, answer each of these questions in 250 words or less. And then at word 251, just cut it off and delete the rest of what they typed. Because it really needs to be even-handed across all the different candidates here. The questions you ask have to be neutral and objective, allowing candidates to present a really thorough and in-depth answer to a question. It can't just be yes or no questions for a debate or for a forum, because it needs to be elucidating what the candidates believe about these issues, as opposed to, is the candidate aligned with your organization? If it's just, is this candidate aligned with your organization's view on an issue? That's simply just essentially an endorsement, right? A C4, a 501c4 could do that and do an endorsement and say, hey, these are the candidates who are aligned on our issue. You should vote for them. But as a C3, the goal isn't to say these are the good candidates. The goal is to say, hey, learn about candidates. We're presenting an opportunity for you to learn about the candidates. Here's how we can do it. And you wind up asking questions that are both open-ended and that address a breadth of issues. It goes back to what we were talking about earlier, where if you're only asking about narrow issues, it's more likely that those candidates are aligned with that particular issue or not aligned with that particular issue and your organization's view on it. But if you ask about a breadth of issues, you're more able to say to the IRS, yeah, we're trying to educate the public about where these folks stand on this variety of issues. And it doesn't become a proxy for candidate A agrees with our position on all these issues and candidate B doesn't. Glenn has a question.
Alan, when you say that you have to ask a set of questions that are a wide variety of different things, do they have to be things that you don't necessarily do as an organization? So if you're an environmental organization, can you ask a lot of different environmental questions? Or are you saying, no, you need to ask environmental plus transportation plus whatever else? Thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked that. So the IRS says that holding like an environmental forum is too narrow. I disagree, and I would fight the IRS on that. And so what I do with clients who are, for example, an environmental organization, I say, we're going to hold a forum on the environment. And we're going to talk about, because these are all environmental issues, right? Transportation is an environmental issue. Wastewater runoff is an environmental issue. Drinking water is an environmental issue. Air pollution, environmental justice, climate change. That we can go on and on, right? There is a panoply of issues that fall within the umbrella of what an environmental organization does. They're all things that an environmental group is going to be interested in. And my view to the IRS would be, yeah, we held this questionnaire and we asked about this in clean energy. There's a diversity of issues, and the issues were broad enough that no candidate is going to align exactly with our organization. And we ask the questions in a broad manner. So it's not simply, our position is that we need a 50% renewable portfolio standard by 2027. Do you agree or disagree? Right? It just says, what are your views about renewable energy? How can we use renewable energy to make an improvement in tackling climate change or lowering consumers' energy costs? So, yeah, that's a really good question, Glenn. What we need to do is we need to walk a line between being what the IRS would say is too narrow and aligning with particular candidates and reframing our issue so that we're staying within our mission, but we're asking various questions about the organization's mission to to drive out those questions. So for example, Horizon Foundation, some people might think is just a health and wellness organization. I would say you would ask questions about COVID, public health, racism, systems change in terms of transportation issues. There's a whole panoply of issues that we can go on and on about, so that we would frame them as these are the issues facing the community, as opposed to these are healthcare issues that Horizon aligns with. And so, for example, this candidates forum talks about it's the school board race, and school board candidates are going to hit a narrow bunch of issues. You're not going to ask school board candidates necessarily about tackling climate change, although I suppose you could, because schools consume a lot of energy. But so they're saying, how do we shape the school district? How do we invest in kids and youth? How do we deal with school safety? So there are a variety of issues that they're addressing in this forum, but they're all related to the issue of being a school board member. And most importantly, we're asking them in a broad, open-ended manner.
Alan,
and then I
there's a
love the
comment
last
in here
line
from Jim.
I love the
Comment
last
from
line
Jim
here
in
where
the
it
chat.
says, be informed so you can cast your vote on election day. So this candidate forum is achieving both educating the public, and it's also doing the nonpartisan get out the vote work. So Jim had a question here about advancing his organization's interests and their mission. Jim, you want to come off of mute and explain what you mean by that?
Well, I think Glenn's question answered it, and that is, with limited time and attention, I don't want to spend a lot of time on extraneous things. I want to focus on the mission of my organization, and ideally, I'd like to do a checklist against priorities, not just general education. So what you've said is, be careful, you can't be too single focused, which is a challenge.
That's right. And there are organizations, so I have organizations that are very narrowly focused on a particular power plant, for example. And when those organizations want to do a candidate forum just on that one power plant, my advice to them is team up with some other organizations in the community that you work in coalition with anyways, and hit their issues, because that will do a number of things. It builds your organization's coalition allies, your allyship with other organizations. It helps lift up our other organizations, and it protects you on this IRS issue. And frankly, it gets more candidates to be willing to be involved. If you're holding a candidate forum or a questionnaire that's only on one single power plant, the candidates know that there's not a lot of benefit to them to answering the questions and showing up at a forum that's just about that one particular power plant, because the people who care about the power plant probably have their minds made up. Instead, if you broaden it out a little bit, talking about the power plant and other community issues, you're more likely to get more involvement from a variety of candidates as well. Thanks for asking that question, Jim. Related to this issue are candidate pledges, which are, for example, this one. This is a candidate pledge for unity, saying, they're trying to get candidates to sign on to say no to critical race theory in the classroom. Now, if we said earlier that your communications can't be a proxy for, does this candidate agree with our organization? Because that's a tacit endorsement. The same with the candidate pledge. Candidate pledges are completely illegal. This is totally illegal for a C3 to do. This organization purports to be, and actually is, a C3. They shouldn't be if they're doing a candidate pledge, because you can't say, these are the candidates who agree with our position. These are the candidates who've taken our anti-critical race theory pledge. That's just illegal for a C3. So they can't be doing this. And whether it's on something like critical race theory or more useful topics, like the ones that organizations on this call are working on, you can't, regardless of how controversial the issue is, I guess is what I'm trying to say, regardless of how controversial the issue is, you can't have a candidate pledge on that issue, because it simply is a way of trying to endorse particular candidates to the public, because you're saying, hey, this is the list of candidates who've taken the pledge, and implicitly those are the candidates we think you should endorse. So regardless of the topic, candidate pledges are just prohibited for C3s. And so this organization should lose its exemption over it. Okay, so that's the panoply of questions about how to educate the public about the candidates. What other questions are there? Are there issues on, issues on that I didn't hit before we move out of the election realm into the policy advocacy realm? All right, as questions arise, please do ask them and just keep me posted on them. Okay, so we're allowed to do, as I said, Laura asks about voting, report cards on voting records. Report cards and voting records need to follow all of the same information. I'm pointing at my screen like you guys can see. They need to follow all of this same information in terms of it needs to be a broad set of issues. You need to look at everybody in the legislature or everybody in your area of coverage. You can't just be on particular candidates. And it winds up being, it can be challenging, especially as things get more partisan, because it winds up looking like a proxy in some situations. It really depends on the context for a report card about voting records. If you are able to, if the legislature is voting on a broad number of issues and you have a bunch of votes to score, and people do, it's not all just binary. These are the people who voted right, and these are the people, and basically everybody either gets 100 or a 0 is the real problem with that. As we get to be more, as society becomes more partisan and legislatures become more divided, if it winds up being everyone's got 100 or 0, it's a real challenge. If people are a little bit more all over the place, and sometimes it means you wind up having to pick more issues to grade than you might otherwise want in order to show some variation there. The more variation you have, the more able you are to show that it's not just a proxy for these are the good candidates in the race. So it is challenging. And if your organization has a related 501c4 that's engaged in election activity, I usually recommend that the organization do that scorecard out of the C4 for a variety of reasons. If you're just a C3 organization, there is ability to do it, but you have to be careful about sort of what impression it sends on that when you're doing a report card about people's voting records. So Olivia has a good question here. If there's no media coverage, can you tell the forum attendees that all candidates were invited, even if not all of them show up? Yes, and I'll go a step further. Even if there is media coverage, you should tell everybody at the forum that all candidates were invited, even if not all of them show up. So media coverage or not, you should let everyone know that we opened this forum up fairly. We gave everyone plenty of advance notice of when it was going to be. And these are the candidates who chose to show up with it. Now, you can't, and I would hope nobody would do this, you can't collaborate with a candidate and say, hey, we're thinking about holding a candidate forum on Thursday night, are you free? And making sure that it works for that one candidate, and then surprised you're gonna invite all the other candidates and it's too soon to make it for the other ones. It winds up just being one candidate on your stage, and you're giving them a platform to essentially talk about their candidacy just by themselves. And so that would be a problem. But to the extent that you give people adequate notice, you do want to try to have a variety of candidates. It does get quite awkward when there's only one candidate on stage for a candidate forum. But yeah, if people don't show up, you can certainly say, hey, we invited everybody. Some organizations put an empty chair up there. That can be kind of aggressive, but it does make a point. So thanks, Olivia. That's a good question. So we talked about at the top, and Joan mentioned that you've still got your right to make public statements about policy issues, even though there's an election going on. Your free speech rights aren't abridged at this point. But the IRS at the same time is trying to determine, is it legitimate policy discussion that you're engaging in, or is it what the Supreme Court once called sham issue ads? Are you really talking about this simply so that you can highlight particular candidates, either in a positive or in a negative way? And so we'll use this as an example where the Horizon Foundation did a recent press conference with the county executive and county council members talking about county transportation policy. So what the IRS is going to look at is, and I'm going to send around all of these slides, by the way, and I'll send around some background information as well that Glenn will distribute out to all the participants. They're going to look at your communication and say, are you talking about a candidate? Are you talking about what your organization thinks about this candidate's policies or positions and actions? They're going to look at whether the timing is in close proximity to the election. And now, importantly, there's no drop dead deadline here, right? There's no 30 days before an election, it's okay, 60 days. There's no specific line. The IRS just looks at the closer you are to an election, the more likely it is that you're trying to influence voters to support or oppose that particular candidate. So you could do an activity that's totally fine in April, but wouldn't be okay in October, just because it's that much closer to election day. And so that proximity to the election it's on a sliding scale of a spectrum of risk there. Is your event talking about an election? Are you referring to voting at your event? Does this policy issue you're talking about distinguish the two candidates in a particular race? And are you taking sides on that issue that distinguishes the candidates? Do you have a pattern and history of working on this issue, of doing this type of event or of doing this type of newspaper ad or radio ad? Or is this new for you? Where now all of a sudden, just because there's an election, you're jumping into doing radio ads, whereas in the past, you would have just sent out a tweet talking about a county member's position on a road bill. And the last thing they're going to look at, or among the last things, they could look at other things as well, is the timing of this related to some event that's outside of your control that's unrelated to the election? Or are you doing this simply because there's an election coming up? So thinking back to this press conference here, where you've got county executive Calvin Ball, you've got some county council members, you've got Horizon Foundation staff at the press conference. Glenn, I'll put you on the spot. I realize now I should have probably let you know I was going to put you on the spot about this, but let's talk through the analysis here of why it would be okay. So thinking through some of these characteristics. So actually, why don't you explain a little bit, give people a little bit of background about this press event here?
Sure. So this was in response to advocacy that we have been doing consistently for years and years about the need for funding for complete streets. So better paths, better bikeways, better walkways, so that people can safely get around. This was celebrating the fact that the county executive put in more than $8 million into the budget, which is far more. It's historic level funding for complete streets. It was tied to his release of the budget. And certainly, as you see, candidates are there, as well as current incumbents who are involved in that process are also at this event. So we thought, if you go to the next, can you go to the next one here? So in looking at all of these things, we've consistently been doing this for a long time, where we would either criticize or celebrate what was put into the budget or what was not put into the budget. It is a part of something that The timing isn't related to a non-electoral event, even though the primary and the general elections are coming up. The budget is done when the budget is done, and that is typically in these months leading up to what is now the primary election. Remember, our primary was moved, so that was an issue throughout as well. So we felt pretty sure that this was an allowable activity.
Well said. Glenn's in training to be a lawyer on campaign finance and nonprofit issues. He's been training for this his entire life. So thank you for being willing to put on the spot here, Glenn.
Sure.
But that's exactly the right analysis. Is they had this. There were certainly candidates that were identified at the event. Ball is running for re-election. So it does identify a candidate. It reflects a view on the candidate's actions. And it does address a policy issue that's going to distinguish the candidates in their election. The timing kind of coincides with an election, but kind of not. It's April. This was done in April. It wasn't done in October. They didn't talk about the election at all. They didn't talk at all about voting. And as Glenn mentioned, it's tied to an event that's beyond their control. They can't control when the budget is going to be announced. They can't get the budget pushed up back into January simply so to make their own nonprofit status safer. So they got to deal with the hand that they're dealt. And importantly, this is the issue that they've been working on. They've been working on getting the county budget to include this money for many years. And so it's not a coincidence that it happened in an election year, right? The election is what gives the members of the county council that impetus to want to fund it. Why? Because they get to take credit for it. They know it's popular, and the work that Horizon has done over the course of years is what's made it popular. It's almost inevitably going to be that you get these types of victories in an election year, because that's when they have the pressure that their feet are being held to the fire in a way to get this done. Now, the trade-off, of course, is you've also created a platform in a way for Council Member Rigby to take credit. She's doing it here in her official capacity, not in her campaign capacity. So there's a real balancing here, but this is a situation where you have to balance these various risks to the organization against the great benefit to the organization of promoting your policy and your mission. So as we started off the whole discussion, you don't want to be paralyzed by the rules. You want to understand what the rules are so you can get your toes up to the line and keep achieving your mission during the election year. And I promise it wasn't a setup. It's not like Glenn and I had rehearsed this. Like I came up with this slide a couple hours ago, and then I just on the spot decided, all right, let's just have Glenn present rather than droning on about it. So thank you, Glenn. I appreciate it. Are there other examples of this that other organizations have seen, or are there situations that you've been presented with or faced where organizations have had to make similar decisions? Or are there other questions about these factors that folks have? We can always circle back and discuss this advocacy more. It really does wind up being very context specific, but you can protect the organization by planning in advance to make sure that you have a pattern and drumbeat on these issues, a pattern in history that you can demonstrate.
Alan, this is Alice, and I do have a question, and this really goes back to my early career working for the IWCA, and again, very focused on women's rights, women's issues, women's right to choose. And I can remember as an organization really taking a stance and being involved, and not so much in terms of the candidates, but very, very vocal as to what we stood for, what we marched for, how that showed up. And I'm sure the media coverage it gained, and it was specifically designed to do so. I look at some of the issues that now we have that we see on TV every day, where you have gun control and who's marching on one side and who's marching on the other. So I'm trying to really take all of this in, and it really clarifies, and you're doing an excellent job. But I guess I want to say it's, for me, it's just, I'm trying to separate kind of what I see sometimes in the media, what my experience has been even in advocating and organizing organizations that had very clearly defined rights, very definitive in what we were standing for and what we were advocating for, and as a 501c3 organization. So either we cross some lines, not knowingly so, and or what do you see as some of the things that you're seeing in the media today, and how they seem to be really teetering on the edge here? I'm just, am I clear?
No, I think that's exactly right. So I'll use the example. There's a march coming up a week from Saturday in DC for sensible gun laws.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe it's being paid for with C3 funds, although it's not a client of mine. So I'm not gonna, I don't know. If you're organizing a march for gun rights, sensible gun laws, I mean, the right not to have to deal with this stuff. If you're organizing a march, then you can be as vocal, you can be very vocal about saying, we need sensible gun laws, that we need an assault weapons ban, we need background checks, etc. But you couldn't at that march say, and we need everybody to vote about it in November, because then you're saying, then you're identifying an issue that distinguishes the candidates, you're talking about voting, it's in proximity to an election, etc. But it'd be fine simply to say, we need change in America. We need to stop assault weapons. We need these laws to be changed, because that is talking about the policy issue, and it's not talking about the election. If you then invite a whole bunch of candidates up to speak in their role as a candidate, so if at this event we have Senator Coons and Senator Murphy talking about the policy issues and not talking about their own elections, again, it's totally fine. But if Senator Murphy gets up there and says, all of these are issues, the Democrats are really good on these issues, so we need to elect Democrats in November, that would mean that it couldn't be a C3 event anymore. So you need to brief, I spend a lot of time making sure you brief the speakers of, here's where the line is, and we're not going to talk, because we're doing this as a C3 rally, we're not going to talk about the election, we're just going to talk about the policy issue. There's certainly a lot of time, though, as you mentioned, Alice, where you want people to vote about it. So it wouldn't be appropriate for a C3 to get involved with that march. You'd want to have C4 colleague organizations supporting the march, and those organizations can support and oppose candidates. And so you would want them having a rally saying, we need sensible gun laws, and we need to elect the people who will deliver them in November, vote for these candidates. And you would just, the C3s would, well, the C3s wouldn't be involved as organizations, and you couldn't use C3 money for it. But anyone can show up from a C3 organization and show up at that march.
Okay.
You wouldn't be paid as a staffer for it. You'd need to either, hopefully it's on a weekend, or you need to take a vacation day. But what you do in your free time is yours. And so you can volunteer to help out the march. You've got special expertise on policy issues. You can lend your expertise as long as you're doing it in your own personal capacity as a volunteer. And whether it's at the march or whether you're volunteering for candidates in the primary election that's coming up in 49 days, you can spend all your time on whatever you want to do in elections, as long as you don't use any of your organizational, any of your employer resources for it. So you can't, for example, use your employer, your Horizon, horizonfoundation.org email address if you're a Horizon employee. You can't use the organization's donor lists or other email contact lists, things like that. You can't use the copy machine. You can't hold events in the conference room of your office for a candidate. But you can volunteer on the weekends. But you wind up saying, hi, I'm Alice. I'm here on behalf of so-and-so candidate. You wouldn't say, hi, I'm here on behalf of my organization talking about this candidate. And so it's important, though, to emphasize that your free time is yours to do whatever you want. It's tricky with work hours. What are work hours, right? Well, your employer personnel policy manual probably says specifically what the work hours are. And as long as you do your volunteer activity outside of those official work hours, you're fine to do whatever you want. If there's a candidate rally in the middle of the day that you want to go to, or if you want to go to a candidate fundraiser in the middle of the day, you shouldn't be doing it on work hours. You'd need to take a vacation day or a part-time break from your day, whatever it is, so that you're off the clock when you're engaging in that campaign activity.
Thank you.
One issue that arises a lot is, I get questions all the time, is where's the line on social media? So for example, you've got a Twitter feed. Where's the line on whether your Twitter feed is a work account or a personal account? So what are some factors that people think they'd look at if they were examining that? Why don't you put it in the chat box? What do you think the IRS would look at to determine, hey, is this when someone posted on Twitter about Governor Hogan, were they doing it as a Horizon employee, or were they doing it as their own personal activity when they were talking about Governor Hogan's whether he should be reelected? Glenn says whether the organization is listed. Carrie, oh, I love that, Carrie. Or opinions are my own, or retweets don't equal endorsements. Yep. And putting that in the bio is certainly a factor. What else? I've got a whole bunch of options, and we'll do it Family Feud style. Yeah, Nancy says identifying your employer. Yep, that's good. Glenn says whether you're the face of the organization. Let's see which ones we've hit. So we've got disclaimer, views are my own. Yeah, Carrie hit that almost word for word. Thank you, Carrie. Your Twitter bio identifies your work role. Yep, which is what Nancy and Glenn both said. Whether your Twitter handle includes the organization's name, which sort of gets to some of these issues. As you see here with Nancy Brown. Nancy Brown is the head of the American Heart Association. Her Twitter handle is Nancy at Heart, which is going to make it look more like this is something that's work related, given that she has heart in her Twitter handle, and her organizational bio identifies her work role. She doesn't have that disclaimer mentioned. The IRS could also look at whether the content is mostly work related or whether it's personal. Are you tweeting about puppies and baseball, or is it all public health? Because if your whole Twitter feed is public health, it's likely that that is something that you're doing in your work context. So, and another is, and this I guess gets to what Glenn is saying, whether you're the face of the organization, is a communication staffer posting your content. And if anyone ever scrolls through at Nancy at Heart, yeah, you're going to guess that it's probably a comm staffer posting her content and not Nancy herself. How does this apply for your organization though, and for you personally? You know that we're in an election season and it's going to heat up. So if you want to claim if your Twitter feed, if you think your Twitter feed is personal, but it wouldn't be evident necessarily to the IRS, to an IRS agent auditing your organization, you might want to take steps now to emphasize that your Twitter feed is a personal account. As Carrie mentioned, including that disclaimer about views being your own. Identifying in your bio some things that aren't just work related. Talk about your personal life and your work life in the bio. It doesn't have to be completely scrubbed of any mention of your work life. Work is part of who you are, but you want to have a variety of stuff there. And start posting some puppies and baseball to your feed. So it's not simply public health until it shifts dramatically from public health into election related content. Keep sprinkling that puppies and baseball in there as well. But these social media accounts really are one of the places where it is hard to determine sometimes whether you're posting in your work role or your personal role, because people do post work related stuff to their personal social media accounts. And so that does become something that winds up getting tricky. So the more we can take steps now to really emphasize that that is a dual account, if it is a dual account, the better off you'll be. Questions about this? Are there things here that surprised anyone? You guys were picking suggestions that were pretty aligned with these ideas.
I have
One
a
thing,
question.
yeah, go ahead.
Oh, so here's a question. I'm sorry, I somehow lost contact.
Yeah.
I'm driving, listening to the webinar. So, if you have a nonprofit and it's for people with disabilities, for autism specifically, and you ask these questions as you pose to the candidates. So, is there anything wrong with putting it in the context as if we put you in that position of that individual with that disability, how would you want the person that is in leadership to react and support? Can you put it in that term, or does it have to be more?
No, I think that you could, so just to paraphrase that a little bit, do your questions have to be sort of sterile policy questions, or can they be more personal? And it's perfectly fine to be more personal.
Right.
The issue
for example, ours are, there's an unfortunate in this wealthy county that we live here in Maryland state in Maryland, there isn't very much in planning for individuals once they come out of high school for vocational housing. It's really a shame.
Mm-hmm.
And those are the questions that around the topic that the questions would be posed. You know, what is their goals or their support that they would give for creating such type of, remember the old VOTEC schools we had when we were kids, things like that. But not just with disabled individuals. Some individuals don't want to go to college and others don't know what they're going to do. But if they learn some skills, they might actually be able to contribute and have meaningful lives. So that would be what all my questions would be posed around to them.
Yeah, the issues there, the way to approach it, whether it's autism or any other of a host of issues, is to ask the questions in an open-ended manner so that it's not evident what answer you're trying to get from them.
Right. So I guess it would be a valid question then to say, if you were in that individual's shoes, what policy and what support would you hope that the candidate or that person in your office would be putting forth? And that would
you can ask the questions in that sort of a broad-based way of asking, if you were in their shoes, what activities or what supports would you want? What programs would you want? Rather than saying, for example, there's this particular program that's funded at this particular level. Would you approve of increasing the funding by 36% for that particular program? Sure. That would be too narrow.
Yeah, okay. So not pinning them against the wall, but really, you know, by putting them in that person's shoes, you are getting their view on how they would probably support or not support.
Right. And but you asked the question in a very broad way. The way that you phrased it was, what programs or support would you want to have, or what programs or support would you think would be helpful? Mm-hmm. Because you asked it in that broad-based way, that enables the candidates to take it in a whole bunch of different directions, and the organization isn't saying that this response is correct and this response is not aligned with the organization.
Yep. Okay. Sounds good.
Question. Yeah. One other issue that arises is, what about having candidates speak at our events, at a gala, for example? Often organizations will have top elected officials as an honorary chair of a gala or speaking at a gala. It becomes more complicated in election years, obviously, because of the issues that we've been discussing. You can have, it depends on, as we see here on the screen, how close in time is the gala to an election? How are you publicizing this gala, or enabling people to, does it create a public platform for that person, I guess would be the good way to put it. What's your pattern in history? Is there a reason that this person has to be invited this year? And so what I generally recommend in terms of things like that, especially if the gala is in the fall of an election year, is alternate, is to have public officials speak in odd numbered years, except in places like Virginia and New Jersey, obviously. But in a place like this, have folks in odd numbered years have the county council, have the county executive host the gala in an odd numbered year, or have the senator speak in an odd numbered year, and not have that person speak in an even numbered year, for example, because of those perception issues, because the IRS will think that you're providing a tacit endorsement of that person. It depends, obviously, if the candidate is up for re-election that year. If it's a senator, maybe you pick the senator who's not up for re-election that particular year. And again, it's just on the spectrum of risk as we're picking people who are going to appear at our events, that there are various trade-offs, and there's some issues that we could do to mitigate the risk, but it is something that you want to keep in mind and be wary of. So the key issues are, and Joan has a question here. What if the county executive speaks at the event every year? Well, then I think looking back at those factors the IRS would look at, you've got a pattern in history of always having the county executive speak at the event. So you could then say, look, it has nothing to do with who this particular person is as a candidate, and it has no relationship to the fact that they are a candidate. It's just every year at this event, we always have the county executive speak. Now, it can't be that when you suddenly have a county executive that you don't like, that you stop inviting them. But as long as you do have that pattern in history, you can say, this isn't related to the election. We're not talking, and then you'd want to make sure that your speakers are all briefed that they don't speak about the election. You want to send them all something in writing in an email, for example, explaining, because our organization is a 501c3 nonprofit, we don't support or oppose candidates. We don't want you to mention the election at all at this event. Make sure you would also want to say, and please don't wear any paraphernalia related to your election, and don't pass out stickers or buttons. If people show up with signs, they can't bring signs in. If people show up wearing campaign clothing, you could make them take off the campaign clothing or turn it inside out, as long as you apply that across the board to everyone who shows up wearing campaign clothing. But it really does get to, tied into Jen's question, how do we document? How do we establish the fact that we're doing it this way? So, as Joan says, if we have this pattern in history, we would want to show that we always have the county executive speak, that we didn't change the timing of this event. We didn't publicize it differently this year than we have in previous years, simply to give the county executive a more prominent publicity related to it. And to document it, you want to save that, you want to save those emails where you said to all the candidates, hey, don't talk about the election. You want to have a memo internally in the file related to that event saying, hey, we're inviting these people. We recognize that they're candidates. We always invite the candidates, et cetera. And you just document what are the questions that were asked at a candidate forum, for example. You document that at a candidate debate, you invited all of the candidates to participate, and you save those materials to show that you invited all the candidates to participate. Thinking through, you want to think through proactively, okay, we're doing this, it's in an election year. Let's try to anticipate what are the questions the IRS would have, and then similarly, how would we respond to those IRS questions? And just make sure that you have those materials on hand so that if you leave the organization and the organization gets audited in 3 years, someone will have that file with all of your documentation in it so that they can just rely on it and say, yeah, these are the reasons that it was okay under the IRS rules. So the key issues here that I want to just emphasize as we head into it, don't hang back. Make sure that you are engaged with your community, make sure that your nonprofit keeps up the advocacy, and make sure that your staff understand that they're allowed to participate in election seasons. Even as a C3 employee, you just want to emphasize to them that they shouldn't be doing it with their work email account, that they should do it at their personal email account, that if they're holding a fundraiser for a candidate, they shouldn't invite the employees that report up to them, for example, because those employees might feel coerced to go to that political fundraiser if it's their boss that's inviting them. And if you're holding a political fundraiser, you shouldn't send a blast email out to all of the supporters that are on your organization's email list, because that's an inappropriate use of the organization's resources. So Nancy asks a good question about, does it matter how political the audience is? What do you mean? Can you give me an example, Nancy?
I'm just thinking of if people come, really just specifically to endorse a particular candidate. So while they appear to be, just there, it also gives the appearance that it's a political event.
So you mean at like a candidate forum, are you talking about, or at a camp or at a fundraiser for an organization?
Like at a candidate forum, or say, for example, where the county executive always comes to speak or something like that, where, I know you can't control the audience. I just wondered how much of a factor that would play into.
Yeah, that's a good question. So at a candidate forum, usually you'll have it moderated by a local journalist or organization that is totally nonpartisan and doesn't look like it has any sort of an axe to grind one way or the other. And they'll generally say to the audience, we want to be respectful. We know that you're all passionate and enthusiastic, but we want to make sure that you give everybody a chance to speak. We want to keep applause to a minimum. Usually you will allow equal opportunity for the different candidates to invite their supporters to attend the event and your organization supporters to attend the forum as well, so that there's an opportunity for everyone to participate, and not to pack the stands. And then in terms of what you said about sort of like the county executive speaking at, well, a good example would be the press conference that Horizon Foundation had, that you would say to them in advance, very specifically, this is being done as an official function. This is not being done in your campaign role. Don't have any campaign supporters appear, and you can't hand out buttons or signs, and anyone who shows up with buttons or signs will be asked to leave. So that you're very clear that it's going to be done regardless of who shows up. This is an official event, not a campaign event. Well, I want to thank you all for your participation and your engagement. They've been great questions. I really appreciate it. And with that, I will turn it over to Glenn for some parting wisdom.
Wisdom, I'm not sure, Alan. You've given us a whole lot of that. Thank you on behalf of all the sponsors. We urge you to continue doing what you do. And now that you know all the rules during election season, don't let anything stop you from advocating for the things that you feel are important. There are rules that allow you to be engaged both as a person and as an organization. And hopefully this has helped clarify some of those sort of thoughts in your head. And if you have any questions at all after today, after you've ruminated on this a bit, please send them along to the email that you'll get with the slides and everything else and the recording of the session, and continue going out there and doing great work. So thanks so much for joining us today. Have a great week. Have a great election season. See you soon.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.